Alright, hands up. Who didn't see this one coming? First, the government failed to convict Cliven the Klansman Bundy and his moonshine militia, and now this. I trust you recognize a pattern at work here, not a new one. The same old one that we've always had. And not just from the jury either, but from the so-called authorities as well. This is why all of these white politicians are so scared to do anything about all of these little race terrorists running around. They've allowed their practice of white privilege to go on for so long to such an extent that you can now conspire to kidnap them and kill them right in front of them, and they can't even get their own neighbors to call it a crime. This wasn't a case of a jury not believing the evidence. This was a case of a jury deciding to disregard it. So 2 of the conspirators were acquitted altogether, and the other 2, well, the jury deadlocked on them. Was this jury nullification? Of course it was. But it's nothing new. It took a whole 3 days for that jury to gather up enough nerve to say that they didn't believe men who had undercover agents who testified against them, people who had pleaded guilty and testified against their own friends, recordings, whatever your feelings about Whitmer or the government, and I'm no fan of either, it's undeniable that, as the prosecutors put it, they trained to kidnap the governor, they cased her home in the middle of the night, they mapped it out. They planned it. They even gathered weapons and bombs. Now, you tell me that if these were some black men plotting to go after a politician, that they would be free if there was the same evidence against them. You had the case in Georgia where Ebony Dickens went on Facebook and gave what was clearly a marijuana-fueled rant, blowing off some hot air and steam about the police. But she was immediately arrested and charged, and it didn't take the feds to do it either. Facebook banned her, and the authorities obviously knew that they didn't have a case because they offered to drop the charges against her if she would just give an apology. If you truly believe that someone is a danger to the police or anyone else, if you truly believe that this person meant what they said, why would you then allow them to get away with it if they just give a measly "I'm sorry"? That's just a case of somebody who needed to blow off some steam. What happened in Michigan, however, is not. Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, he had been part of the Michigan militia, you'll recall. He trained with them before carrying out his act of mass murder. And that's another thing. McVeigh's accomplice, Terry Nichols, the white media didn't treat him like an accomplice in mass murder, including the deaths of children. The interviews they were doing with Terry Nichols, they were treating him practically as sympathetically as you would think they would treat him if he was one of the bomb's victims. As we've seen with a number of mass killers, that happens to be another classic of the white media playbook. And as the co-conspirators who were acquitted in the plot to go after Governor Whitmer, these clowns will inevitably wind up on Fox News or some other right-wing sewer and expect them to get the Rittenhouse treatment. It's obvious that they were thwarted terrorists, but the right wing will hold them up, and with a wink and a nod, they'll tell their fellow white supremacists that these guys are champions of free speech. Of course, their definition of free speech is hate speech. But by then, the point will be made. They didn't get punished. That's the point. Which in their minds is no different than if they had committed the crime and gotten away with it. The world needs to be made safe for all of these sawed-off extremists to plan their attacks. 2 years ago, when people were taking to the streets to demand change, we saw what the police and the authorities' reaction was to that. They were rounding people up wholesale. But of course, that wasn't going to happen here, not just because of the politicians like Whitmer and her Democrat state attorney general, but also because of people like Sheriff Darleaf. This guy, you'll recall, he sympathized with and justified the idea that these militias could arbitrarily, on their own authority, kidnap the governor if they felt she'd broken their laws. Darleaf said he knew some of the kidnap plotters who had been arrested. Darleaf had himself attended a so-called rally held by that very same militia. That's the reason why these guys were so emboldened. Just like Cliven Bundy, there's always talking about how I don't recognize no authority except for the sheriff, the local sheriff. I only recognize his authority. The leader of the local clavern. So these white militias are protected by belligerent elements on the right in the government who encourage and protect them, and capitulating and surrendering elements on the left who aren't going all out to stop them. But as I and others have pointed out to you numerous times, when it comes to the white left, that's the problem for them, even under these circumstances. As they see it, they're trapped on the horns of a dilemma. They have to preserve the system of white supremacy that has enabled them, the white left, to enjoy the power and privilege that they have, while at the same time they can't keep these violent internal elements within white supremacy from harming them without having to erode or otherwise diminish their white privilege, especially that immunity from law. And no matter what their rhetorical differences may be, the white left and the white right are both handcuffed and depending on the exact same system of white privilege to take care of both of them. Once you revoke it for one of them, then all the beneficiaries of white privilege become subject to having their privileges revoked. Only a united front can maintain the system of giveaways, goodies, and guarantees handed to those classified as white. And while it's undeniable that Sheriff Darleaf is clearly an unhinged lunatic, as we see with this case, he's not alone. Any more than Cliven the Klansman Bundy and the Moonshine Militia were some fringe element. They're not fringe elements at all. What you have are individuals who are either openly hostile white supremacist extremists, or you got those who are clearly very, very sympathetic towards them. Oh yeah, it's okay to say that about radical Muslims. You can say that about radical Muslims all day. Most of the people who practice Islam, why, if they're not terrorists, they're certainly sympathetic to those who do. That's what Bill Maher would be saying back in the day. But when it comes time to talk about white privilege, comes time to talk about that white privilege here in the U.S., all of a sudden, we don't apply the same terms, even though this is the main place where that kind of comparison would apply. There are those who gladly carry out the violence, and those who are sympathetic to and supportive of those who carry out the violence. The defense attorneys for these coup plotters, they said that it was all government entrapment. Well, the people who they claimed were entrapped testified against their buddies at trial, saying that they were not entrapped, by the way. So the folks claiming that, this was all just government entrapment, it's your word versus the guys who you claim were entrapped. So who do you think's going to carry more weight? Now, there's some of you, by the way, who clearly have spent too much time listening to the white conspiracy corner, and you've let their one or two insincere words of sympathy con you into thinking that you've got something in common with them when you don't. By the way, there's also white supremacist troll accounts too, trying to spread these asinine talk. It was entrapment. These are the people who will claim that the January 6th insurrectionists were just a normal tourist visit to the Capitol. There are some white supremacists who are claiming that it was the FBI and Black Lives Matters who stormed the Capitol, that it was all a government plot meant to frame them and make them look bad. Oh yeah, these guys are operating out of the same playbook. They drag out these same talking points whenever they get their butts in a crack. But the similarities with the January 6th insurrectionists doesn't stop there. In 2020, Michigan was the site of the first trial run for the Capitol insurrection. A white supremacist mob laid siege to the Michigan Capitol building, armed and screaming for the governor's head, same way they would be screaming for the vice president's head some months later. After Governor Whitmer and her professional do-nothing organization calling itself a government did nothing about that situation, how it escalated, next thing you know, we saw the plot to kidnap Governor Whitmer and to hold a mock trial, which was meant to end with her being executed. Now keep in mind, it was the black media who was warning everyone that Governor Whitmer's refusal, not failure, but refusal to go after those coup plotters who laid siege to the Michigan legislative building, when they decided that they weren't going to do anything about that, well, hell, you're giving them the green light to do whatever the hell they want to do, and that this was going to only embolden them. They were not going to go home and calm down, talking about how we need to be nicer, let's be more considerate. All you've told them is that you're theirs for the taking. And also the refusal of Democrats who actually do control legislatures in other states to do what they see the Republicans doing, which is Republicans use their little bully pulpits as a means to do troll legislation. Democrats are in a position where they, at the state level, can do real legislation to go after these white supremacist militias, to make it where it's going to be easier for prosecutors to go ahead and lock these guys up. But of course, if you make it where especially white men with guns feel reticent about using them, well, those irregular forces of white supremacy, which is what these guys represent, these irregular forces are going to start being reluctant to stick up for the cause. And you can't have that. So you see, even these Democrats, they got one eye on the white supremacist militias with guns pointed at their heads, and the other eye on black people, and you can see clearly which one they're more concerned about. So, just as with all of these other instances, don't expect to see any Democrats trying to kick off some wave of state-level legislation to make it easier to go after these guys. Obama called those young freedom fighters in the streets of Baltimore thugs. Well, fortunately for these moderate Michigan militia types, the Gretchen Whitmers and the Attorney General there and the Democrats in general are being far, far more judicious and reserved with their wording. I mean, after all, you wouldn't want to prejudice a jury or anything, right? You can call black youth in the streets fighting for their lives thugs. We ain't got to worry about prejudicing a jury, especially if a president's the one talking this way about them. But when you got some guys who've been caught on video, recorded, saying how they want to take out the governor, well, we shouldn't say anything. It would be prejudicial, don't you know? But the prosecutors have said that they intend to retry the remaining 2 conspirators who didn't get acquitted, but the charges will surely be far lower. This isn't like Bill Cosby, folks. There's not going to be any prosecutors going on some jihad, willing to break laws, or even bend them, or trying to introduce inadmissible evidence, or judges who would allow them to do so. So for the lead paint slurping inbreds who want to talk about entrapment, I'm not surprised that none of you showed up when it came time to talk about Cosby. Now there's your entrapment. And not only has no one even been charged for violating Bill Cosby's rights, you got people trying to defend it. Government prosecutors only violate the constitutional rights of white militiamen, it seems. We're told that this was all free speech. That's the narrative that some would like to try to gin up here. But what part of free speech involves holding numerous meetings where you discuss kidnapping someone, then casing the house of that person and trying to get your hands on weapons to do it with? If this is free speech, then Ebony Dickens wasn't the one who should have been giving the apology. The police and prosecutors in Georgia who arrested and charged her, they should have been. But for the people trying to minimize all this, you'll get plenty of other opportunities to stick up for the next Michigan militia members who plot some violent terrorist action. And we already know what the talking points are going to be, just like the January 6th coup. They'll go from saying it was just words and they didn't mean it and they're covered by the First Amendment to saying that whomever they killed deserved to die and the tree of liberty must occasionally be watered from time to time, etc. See, those are the 2 standby talking points that they're always ready to use. If they don't manage to pull off whatever the plan was, well, these guys, obviously they weren't serious, otherwise they would have succeeded. Haha, wink wink, nudge nudge. So this is just some guys who are blowing off some steam, probably watched a few too many movies or whatever. Give them a slap on the wrist, they're white, so don't do anything to them. And if it works, well, this should let you know the level of discontent in the country. Why? They're no different than the Founding Fathers, you see, no different than the Founding Fathers. The tree of liberty, the tree of liberty. Notice how they never drag out that talking point or talk about trees of liberty and such when it's black people who are being accused of some radical action. If there's some black folks who get accused of something, like say you got some Z-list actor in Chicago who is accused of some sort of hoax, they don't sit there and say, well, he's covered by the First Amendment. Obviously, he didn't mean it. Look how incompetent Jussie Smollett was. Why should we take this seriously? We should all just move on. Oh, no, as far as they're concerned, hell no. This guy, he killed President Kennedy the way they were acting. In their minds, they have the right to water the tree with the blood of other people. That's what they're declaring. Anyone else, well, that's anarchy, chaos, etc. But them, on the other hand, well, that's their prerogative, that's their privilege, that's their right. And only theirs. White supremacy's only values are moral relativism and situational ethics. And with this latest fiasco, they're certainly wearing out that last one. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Mandisa, Stay Positive, Stephen Mugisa, Fatis Mokhtar, and Bobby Williams. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.